I can either do the good morning class or the Jason Robards, good morning, campers. Anyways, so over the next few days, I'm going to be discussing a bunch of sets of topics. And today's topic is how we got to where we are today with energy. Tomorrow, I'm going to talk about how to design a solar home, how to design a house that takes advantage of the sun to heat, to cool, to take care of itself without necessarily a lot of hardware. And I'll be talking about the sun and where it goes and all that. On Wednesday, I'll be talking about Star Island itself and how to run a microgrid, which is what this island is. It's its own entire separate utility. Thursday, I'll be talking about the future, technology and where technology is going and where the energy markets and things like that are going. And on Friday, I'll be talking about policy and policy implications and the basic rules of energy. What makes the energy world work socially and politically. So anyways, to start out with, let's go all the way back. Now it's one of those things that they say about being a speaker that, if you're nervous, imagine the audience naked. Well, this is going to be a change in that because the audience is going to have to imagine itself naked. So this is a very dim photograph.
That's much better.
Of a forest. So I want you to imagine yourself standing in a clearing in a forest, a very old forest, an old growth forest, huge trees, cathedral-like space underneath the trees, like forests were 100,000 years ago. And let's say it's October and it's a little bit cool. It's towards the end of the day. The sun is starting to go down over the trees in the clearing. And you walk to the edge of the clearing next to a big tree and you take off all your clothes and you walk into the forest. You are now experiencing the fundamental problem of energy for humanity. The problem that our ancestors faced centuries and centuries and aeons ago. You have a certain amount of energy in your body. Actually, maybe you could turn up the lights just because that's yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. There we go. Because that's a fairly useless photograph anyway. But anyway, so you're experiencing the fundamental problem of humanity. You are in the same category as a white-tailed deer or a woodchuck or anything else out there. You have the amount of energy that's in your body. And you have to find a source of energy, consume it, and metabolize it fast enough to exceed the amount of energy that you are expending just to keep your body functioning, to do the things you want to do, and to counteract your loss of heat to the world. So what we'll call your natural energy cycle is measured in hours. You don't have days or weeks to do this. You have hours to get food, eat food, metabolize food, and make it part of you so that you can keep going. And for aeons, this was what our forebears dealt with, right? They found food, they ate it, they metabolized it. They found more food, they ate it, they metabolized it. And the human energy cycle was very short. Now, since then, the history of human beings and energy has been an escape from nature, a flight away from nature, and an attempt to escape that brief energy cycle where you're always on the hunt for energy. And the beginning of that was simply food preservation. Getting some form of food, drying it, fermenting it, smoking it, putting it in a granary, container of some sort. Which is why I said that aside from fire, the greatest energy invention in human history was beef jerky. Because that was taking an incredibly calorie and protein-rich source of energy and putting it in a form that you could actually keep it for months, right? That beef jerky extended the human energy cycle from a matter of hours to a matter of weeks or months. That was huge. You didn't have to go like, what am I going to eat today? You had a pile of stuff that you could eat a month from now, 6 months from now. And when we started actually getting into not just preserving food, but growing food, having livestock, right? Where here's protein and fat and calories on the hoof. It can walk around, you can bring it with you, it transports itself, and you can keep it for that special day in February when you're hungry and you've got calories, right? You're not going to die in the middle of winter. And when we started not just collecting grain, but growing grain, like saying, okay, here it is, and I can now collect it, I can store it, and it's there for me in February. The agricultural revolution was a huge revolution in extending that energy cycle so that we didn't have to worry about today and tomorrow. We could worry about 6 months from now, or a year from now, or even 2 years from now. And that kind of extension of the cycle was really what allowed what we call human civilization, because you weren't caught up in the moment, just trying to stay alive. You now had a future, and you had to plan, and you had to organize, and you had to organize groups in a way that you didn't have to before for agriculture. And that's what expanded human civilization, was a byproduct. Human civilization is a byproduct of seeking and storing energy. And there was an economist who's a friend of my family's from years ago who taught at Middlebury, and he, a few years ago, a number of years ago, he's been gone for a while, said to me, the future of energy invention is not going to be in production, it's going to be in storage. That's going to be the key. And later, thinking about that, said, yeah, it's always been the key, energy storage, from the very beginning. So we've gotten human beings to where we're actually storing our own personal energy, our food energy. But then there's another part of that energy cycle, which is how we expend energy. And so, so there's your drying food, there's your energy storage, there's your energy storage, there's your granaries. Those are Dogon granaries in Africa. They've been doing that for I don't know how many 10,000s of years. Next, we go to energy out. How do we slow down the energy coming out of us? And one of that is by creating microclimates. And you can leave them up, they'll show up. Your basic shelter is a microclimate. You're creating an area around you that is separate from the wind and the cold and all that. And this is important because it's slowing down your expenditure of energy to the world. And So here's, that's not Chaco Canyon, that's Pueblo, I can't remember the name of that.
Dwellings?
What?
Cliff Dwellings in Durango?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. But of course, you know, these folks, they figured out, oh yeah, you know, we build a massive adobe structure under an overhanging south-facing cliff, and we are actually storing energy in the walls of our buildings. The sun comes in, heats the walls of our buildings, and that solar energy stores in there and then releases into the interior over time. So they were storing energy in their actual building structures, creating a microclimate where they didn't have to expend as much energy. And there's a better view. A longhouse, New England. This is what you would have seen all over New England, you know, a couple hundred years ago to a few thousand years ago. Again, a microclimate. You could build fires inside, you could store your food inside, and so on. And of course, clothing. Clothing was very important. That's a young, very young Robert Vaughn, by the way. Again, clothing. We think of it today because we have you know, heating and air conditioning and all that kind of stuff. We don't think about it as much unless we're out camping or something. But really, when you're wearing clothing, you're creating a microclimate around your body. And that microclimate you carry with you everywhere. I'm going to get to the toaster in a minute, but I'm going to talk about how heat goes from one place to another. Now, last night I said heat does not rise. Or you've all heard, oh yeah, heat rises. Heat does not rise. Heat goes from the hot place to the cold place. If I have a hot brick and I have a cold brick and I put them together, I can align them in any direction and heat will go up, down, sideways, or down at an angle to get from the hot brick to the cold brick. Or if I hold the hot brick out in the air, it will go from the hot brick to the cooler air around it. Now what does happen is that when you heat air, it becomes buoyant and hot air will rise above cold air. And that's where we get the idea of heat rises. But stop thinking about it that way. Just think about it from the hot place to the cold place. So there's three ways. There's conduction, there's convection, and there's radiation. Conduction. If I have a copper rod in my left hand and a broomstick in my right hand, and I put them into a campfire, which one will I drop first? You better believe the copper rod, I'm going to be dropping that very quickly. The wooden stick, I could light the end on fire and hold it in the air like a torch, and it wouldn't bother me at all because wood is a very poor conductor of heat. But conduction is just heat traveling through a substance from one end to another. And anything that's a good conductor of electricity is probably a good conductor of heat. And anything that you put your hand on and it feels cold is probably a decent conductor of heat. You can go and put a piece of marble and a piece of foam next to each other in a place, and they're the same temperature, and you put your hand down on them, and the marble feels cold and the foam feels warm, because the heat is transferring out of your hand into the marble, because it's a good conductor, and so it feels like it's cold, because you can feel the heat traveling out of your hand. So there's conduction. Convection is when you get a fluid, either air or water, to pick up heat from a surface and carry it somewhere, and then drop it off. And convection, that's wind chill. The wind chill factor. Wind comes up, the wind hits you, gets some heat, and goes away. And it's a lot of heat can go away from you that way. And that's why the microclimate of clothing is so important. And radiation. The sun is 9.8 million miles away from us. And yet, I got some pink on my cheeks from being outdoors yesterday. That's radiation. That's just the electromagnetic radiation traveling through space. If you're standing near a wood stove and you can feel the heat from the wood stove, that's radiation. If you're standing next to a window in the winter and you can feel, in effect, the cold of the window, what's happening is you're radiating heat through that window to the coldness outside, the lower temperature outside. You're hot, it's cold, you're radiating out there. And I suppose I should just make a little note about the greenhouse effect that we hear about so much. The greenhouse effect is fairly simple, and if you have an actual greenhouse with glass in it, visible light goes through the glass very easily. With low lead glass, it can be 95%. Hits the dirt or whatever inside the greenhouse. The light is absorbed in the dirt or whatever. Once the dirt reaches a higher temperature than the air in the greenhouse, it starts radiating back out, but not as light. The dirt does not glow, you'll notice. It comes back as infrared, a lower frequency of radiation. Heat, infrared radiation, comes back, and not quite as much of it goes back through the glass, because the glass is better at letting light through than infrared radiation through, and so you get the greenhouse effect. And the greenhouse will heat up, and as it heats up, now remember I told you that heat goes from the hot place to the cold place, and the bigger the difference, the faster it goes. So as the greenhouse heats up, more and more heat is going back through the glass. As the temperature becomes 85, 95 inside, and let's say it's 60 outside, more and more heat's going through. And at a certain point, there's as much heat going back out as is coming in, and it stays that temperature, the stagnation temperature of the greenhouse. And it'll stay that temperature. But then if I were to come along and spray the greenhouse with a coating that made it more resistant to infrared, then less infrared would go out, and the temperature, the set point temperature of that would go up. And that's what's happening with the atmosphere, of course. Carbon dioxide is like that little spray coating, and methane and those other things about that spray coating, making the atmosphere more resistant to infrared going out. Not that complex. So, we're going to be talking about, over the next few days, heat and energy and electricity and things like that. And I'm going to want to use units. I'm going to want to actually quantify some of this. And so there's all these units of power, energy, BTUs, kilowatt hours, megajoules, things like that. And what is a kilowatt? What's a kilowatt hour? What's a BTU? What are these things? All right, so now you've all probably heard of kilowatt hours. You pay a bill every month for some number of kilowatt hours, right? Yeah? A toaster uses about 1,000 watts. When you hit that button, and if you had a meter on it, a watt meter, it would go to about 1,000. That's power. What something is using or producing, in the case of a solar panel, in the moment. So 1,000 watts. So you think about a kilowatt, that's a toaster. Now let's say you had a bunch of people over for breakfast. A bunch of people. And they all wanted toast. It was a big toast morning. So you just had that toaster going for about an hour. You were just toast, toast, here you go, toast, toast. Eggs? No, okay, toast. Oatmeal, toast. So you kept this going for 1 hour. It would be 1 kilowatt for 1 hour, which is a kilowatt hour. Which is energy, not power. Power over time is energy. So 1 hour, a toaster hour. A kilowatt hour is a toaster hour. All right, so that, all right, okay, we got that. And people will make that mistake. You'll see it in the newspaper all the time, and for energy wonks like me, our heads explode. Because you read the paper and it's like, the solar array will produce, 550,000 kilowatts a year. No! It will produce kilowatts in the moment, it will produce kilowatt hours over a year. And you know, it's just like everybody's got, I'm sure you all have your own specialties and you all have your own thing that you read something in the paper, you go, no, that's not how it is. And for us, it's kilowatt hours and kilowatts. And in fact, the sign over by the solar array is backwards. It uses kilowatts for kilowatt hours and kilowatt hours for kilowatts. So when you read that, reverse it. You know, it's everywhere. It's just like, if you want to be really irritated, if you're in the energy business, you want to be really irritated, you just read signs. Anyway, whoops, I want to go back. Okay, that's a bicycle generator, right? That's an ordinary bicycle with a belt and a little generator. This is another way to think about a kilowatt hour. If you were, on average, any of you were to get on that bike and pedal away at pretty much the rate you could for 10 hours, you would produce about a kilowatt hour. Human being can put out about 100 watts continuous over time. So kilowatt. So if you pedaled on that for 10 hours, you'd produce about 15 cents worth of energy. That's so pathetic, isn't it? People when you're in the renewable energy, people say, why don't they take all the machines at the gym and put generators on them? Like, yeah, 15 cents each per day. If you're really, if you're total triathletes. There was in a place in Nevada called Battle Mountain, the longest, straightest stretch of road in America, flattest, straightest stretch of road in America. They have a human-powered vehicle competition every year, and the speed record is up around 80 miles an hour. They have these bicycles that look like a carbon fiber sweet potato, with like a little bit of wheel sticking out the bottom. And there's this guy named Sam Whittington who almost flew. He pedaled a bike at 82 point something miles per hour. And at the time he was doing 82 miles an hour, he was using 450 watts, which for a human being is just absurd. I mean, the guy is a mass of muscle, but most of us, we're never going to hit that. It's just not. It's not in the cards. So that's another way to think of a kilowatt hour, and it's a way to think of like our ancestors when they first got electricity. When there was first rural electrification, all that, people were paying the equivalent of 50 cents to $1 a kilowatt hour, and they were like, "Yeah, this is great," because you had one, for 50 cents, you got a person on a bike for 10 hours, equivalent, who you didn't have to pay otherwise, who didn't complain, who never got drunk, who never failed to show up. It was like, yeah, electricity, 50 cents a kilowatt, we're all over it. And the first machine that did washing machine, out on the farms, washing machine, clothes washing, yeah. So a horsepower, what's a horsepower? Like, the car has got 350 horsepower. This is from the early days of steam engines, and it's a marketing term. Go figure. This was when they were trying to market steam engines. It was like, this has 3 horsepower. Wow. Basically, how much could a horse lift over a period of time? And basically, 550 pounds, 1 foot in 1 second. So you have a horse and a pulley and a 550-pound weight. That horse can lift that weight 1 foot in 1 second. That's 1 horsepower. That's power. And if you wanted energy, could you do it for an hour, a horsepower hour? So I'm not even going to go into megajoules. That's scientific notation. But I'll give you a joule. A joule is 1 watt for 1 second. So if you've got like a little 1 watt Christmas bulb and you turn it on for 1 second, that's 1 joule. So a megajoule is 1,000,000 Christmas lights on for 1 second.
Cool.
Yeah, right? Yeah. And BTUs, we hear about BTUs all the time, British thermal units. A British thermal unit technically is the amount of heat needed to raise 1 pound of water 1 degree Fahrenheit. pints a pound the world round.
Right.
So a pint of water, if you can raise a pint of water 1 degree Fahrenheit, that's a BTU. It's also, roughly speaking, the amount of energy in a kitchen match. If you light a kitchen match and you let it burn down until it singes your fingers, you have expended 1 BTU. So your standard box of Ohio Blue Tips is 250 BTUs, right? Think about lighting that up, right? That's not anywhere near here, out on the rocks. Ohio Blue Tips, that's 250 BTUs. 4 of them is 1,000 BTUs. So if you see something rated in, like 5,000 BTUs, think about 20 boxes of matches, right? It's equivalent to burning 20 boxes of matches in an hour. Or a shot glass full of gasoline.
Whoa.
That's 1,000 BTUs, roughly, very roughly speaking. Shot glass of flaming shots, you know. So now that's our units. So next stage in human use of energy, substituting work, right? So we've got about 100 watts in us, right, continuous. So if you think about someone working a 6-hour day, you know, hoeing potatoes or whatever, you know, out there in your primitive agricultural world,
That's me.
you're going to get about 600 watt hours, not even a kilowatt hour, not even a toaster hour. Like you're going to get 6/10 of the way through the hour and there's no more toast, right? So 600 watt hours is what you can get out of a human being. And it takes, in an ideal world, about 2 acres of land to keep a human being going, like in a primitive agricultural society. That's if, like, there's no droughts, no, you know, weird weather, you know, good conditions, 2 acres. So you say, all right, I got 2 acres set aside for this human being, and I'm going to get 600 watt hours a day out of this person. Kind of feeble. However, if I get a horse, not only do I not have to grow as complex a set of food for that horse, I can just grow hay, right? The horse can put out how much? Horsepower, right? 746 watts. Not 100 watts, 746 watts. Over about 6 hours. 6-hour workday. Now you may have heard that song when you were a kid about the Erie Canal. 15 miles on the Erie Canal. Why 15 miles? Why not 16 miles or 12 miles or 18 and a half miles? Because horses and mules traveled about 2.5 miles an hour and they had a 6-hour shift. And they figured after 6 hours, you know, that was it. And they do another shift of animals. So 6 times 2.5, 15 miles on the Erie Canal was about how much you could get out of a horse in a day. So 6 hours, you're getting 4,500 watt hours. Instead of 600, you're getting 4,500. And again, you're about 2 acres to keep that horse in business because they're just eating grass, not anything more sophisticated. So you're getting way more energy, work energy, out of your horse for that 2 acres as opposed to the human being for the 2 acres. So you're making much more efficient use of your agricultural land. And back a couple hundred years ago, about 20 to 25% of the arable farmland was set aside for draft animal feed. So if you had 100 acres, 25 of those acres were just feeding the horse. And so I'm gonna talk about a concept called EROI, energy return on investment. Now, we're all familiar with financial return on investment. You know, I invest $100, I'm gonna get 3%, you know, for return on investment, 3% a year, blah, blah, blah. Well, energy return on investment, same thing, but just energy, because it takes energy to get energy, right? You know, when you're dealing with like oil or something, oil doesn't just jump out of the ground and go walking over where you want it to be. you have to explore for it, you have to drill for it, you have to build equipment, you have to, do all this stuff to get oil out of the ground. So you have to invest a certain amount of energy, oil equivalent energy, to get that oil out. And so the EROI of primitive agricultural society with draft animals was about, 4 to 1, right? 3 to 1, 4 to 1, something in there, where you were using, a quarter of your energy. You had, 75% of your total energy, net energy, that you could actually use for what you wanted, right? Feeding yourself. I would note that you can't have a very sophisticated society in terms of technology if you've only got an EROI of about 4 or 5 to 1, right? Because you're using so much of your energy just to get more energy. It's a big drain on what you're doing. So then people started going elsewhere for energy, and we start having, do I have appropriate? Yeah, windmills. Over 1,000 years ago, probably 1,500 years ago in Persia, they started doing vertical axis windmills for grinding grain. And so suddenly your EROI went way up because you were just building this simple wooden structure, and it would sit there and use just the wind that was there anyways coming by, and you could get 5 or 10 horsepower just as long as the wind was blowing. So it was an incredible increase, but it was variable, right? With a horse, you could just say, all right, let's go. And, the horse might have an opinion, but, off it goes, and you get your energy when you want to. These were much better in terms of your energy return on investment, but they were variable and unpredictable, and you had to adapt your life to that, grind grain when the wind was blowing. And so think about that for the future and storage, because if you think about it, you were storing energy in the form of grain, right? Grain was the purpose of that device, turning grain into flour. And so you were taking grain, and as the opportunity arose, grinding grain, and you were storing that necessary energy in that system as bags of flour. And watermills, again, thousands of years ago, 1,500 years ago, people started using water wheels. And again, you could get, out of a 12-foot drop, you could get 5 or 10 horsepower. And again, it was less variable than wind, right? Because you have a stream flow and it's somewhat there. But again, you have dry spells and you have wet spells, and so your control over that energy source got a little more refined, but it wasn't totally under your control. You were still a servant of the climate, right? That depending on whether it was August or whether it was May, you were sawing more lumber, grinding more grain, or less. So they would also have a pond upstream of these, and they would store water in the pond. So again, they were storing energy maybe for a half a day or something like that. So they stored energy as water, they stored energy as their final product. But again, human beings adapting themselves to the energy flows of the environment, as opposed to today, where we adapt the environment to our desires. At a certain point, human beings started discovering this black rock in the ground and burned coal. And starting in the 17th century, late 17th century, people started figuring out ways to turn this coal into motion. Newcomen, Watt, got a unit named after him. He was that important. But they started building steam engines of one type or another, and most of the steam engines were about pumping out mines. That's what they needed to do. They were getting metal out of the ground, and the mines were filling up with water, and so they wanted to pump water out of the mines. And that's where you start getting the horsepower as well, because they use horses on treadmills to run the pumps. And so they were competing with horses on treadmills. And so like, well, this is 3 horsepower or 5 horsepower steam engine. And so that's how they marketed them to the mine owners. This is what's called dispatchable power. Because once you have coal that you can burn at your discretion, a pile of coal you can burn at your discretion and get energy out, that means you can say, yeah, I want to turn this off, I want to turn this on, I can get it where I want it, when I want it. So there are two important things about the transition to coal and steam. One was, like I say, dispatchability, and 2 was this energy cycle. Because remember, back at the beginning, we're all standing there naked in the woods, we got hours. We've got hours before we die, right? And now we've gotten to the point where we can store food to make us survive, for a year. We can pile up firewood and heat our homes for a year or 2 years. But even with firewood, you're reliant on the cycles of nature for more trees. And in fact, in the 18th century, the reason why people started burning coal for heat was because, for instance, in Philadelphia, in the United States in the 18th century, they were traveling like 60 miles outside the city. They had cut the trees down so far away from Philadelphia that they were sending wagons for days to pick up firewood and bring it back to the city. And it's expensive, but coal, much more energy concentrated, and you could dig it up and bring it much more economically into the city. But the other important thing about coal is, in terms of how much they were using back in the 17th, 18th century, it was infinite. Like, there was no cycle. Nature had laid down coal 268 million years before, right? We're talking hundreds of millions of years of stored sunlight in these layers of coal, all compacted, really high quality, a lot of energy per pound, per cubic foot, and it was essentially infinite. We went from a cycle, right, from an hourly cycle as ourselves naked in the woods, to maybe a daily, weekly cycle, to a several year cycle of nature, to a flat line. When we discovered fossil fuels, we escaped the cycles of nature. We were no longer bound by when things grow and when things die. And that was a huge inflection point in human society, in energy use, in level of technology, and level of civilization, and all that, because coal, mined by hand, has an EROI of about 100 to 1. You put in a ton of coal in energy into mining coal, you get 100 tons back out, and you have 99 left over to play around with. And that's when everything took off, right? Because we went from like, oh, we've got 100 units of energy here, 25 of them are just going to go down the horse, right? And we're never going to see that again except to shovel it out of the barn. Whereas now it's like, oh, we've got this steam engine, takes a lot of maintenance, some professionals have to deal with it, but it never gets tired. It doesn't die on us. And we've got 100 to 1. We have this tiny little energy expenditure, and we get all this energy out, and it goes on forever. We just keep digging, and there's always more. Wow. It's a new era. And what we see is that the amount of energy that human beings use as a planet and per person just goes up, goes nuts right then. End of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, it's just... And then, I want to talk about how when Europeans were heading west, into Pennsylvania, they ran into some Native Americans that had some interesting customs. They would set the surfaces of ponds on fire. They would throw their blankets on the surface of the ponds and soak up this black goo and wring it out and use it as medicine. And they were Seneca Indians, and it was known as Seneca oil. And pretty soon, European entrepreneurs started collecting this oil and making medicine out of it. And Seneca oil became snake oil. Of course, it was crude oil. In the western Pennsylvania at that time, they were getting salt by drilling down into salt caverns under the ground. They pump water and get brine out, boil it off, get salt. But periodically they drill in and they get this black goo out of the thing, and they like made the connection. Oh, this is Seneca oil. And eventually somebody boiled some of the stuff and got this stuff called kerosene. That was a wonderful replacement for whale oil.
Wow.
And by the 1850s, the whalers were going around the Horn and up into the Bering Strait. You know, they had killed all the whales all the way up north. So they spent years out there, and whale oil was incredibly expensive. And so when somebody's like, hey, you can take this Seneca oil and you can boil it off and get whale oil out of it, you're like, yeah. And so the guy on the right with the big hat, that's Colonel Drake. He wasn't really a colonel, but he called himself Colonel Drake. And the other guy is Uncle Billy Smith. And in 1859, they drilled the first purposeful oil well in Oil Creek, Pennsylvania. And they drilled down 68 feet and hit oil. And it was coming out so fast that they were just like scouring the countryside for barrels to put it in, right? And so they just had barrels, and they were the standard barrel, 42-gallon barrels that they put it in. And that's why we talk about oil, barrels of oil, millions of barrels of oil. We're still measuring oil in terms of wooden barrels that Uncle Billy Smith used in 1859 to, like old whiskey barrels, basically, to store this stuff. So, of course, the whaling industry collapsed almost instantly because there was just like, infinite quantities of this stuff coming out of the ground. And again, we were tapping into another infinite supply of energy, right? I mean, just seemingly infinite. Again, tens of millions of years ago, millions of years of sunlight laid down, algae laid down, and compressed, and heat, and all that, and created this incredibly concentrated energy source. It was even more concentrated and useful than coal, because coal was a solid. This was a liquid. You could transport it. You could carry it in a can. In 1876, Nicholas Otto, appropriate name, but OTTO, developed an engine that would burn a distillate of this Seneca oil, this snake oil, called gasoline. And 1893, a guy named Rudolph Diesel, you may have heard of him, took some of that kerosene. He developed another kind of engine. And so we were able to turn this infinite, seemingly infinite source into motion and work. Now, at the beginning of the oil industry, the EROI for oil was something around 1,200 to 1. I mean, the stuff just came, you drilled down 68 feet with a wooden tower and an iron bar, and it came gushing out of the ground under its own power, and you just collected it in barrels. Like, it wasn't that expensive in energy. And, eventually, when we got to West Texas in the 19-teens and 20s, it was down to about 300 to 1. Because they were, getting bigger and fancier about the equipment, but still, incredible energy profit ratio, incredible energy return on investment. And so that is what really, if coal made things take off, oil really made things take off, because you had 3 times the energy return on investment. And it was so much easier to get, and more efficient to get motion out of it, right? A gasoline engine was, average gasoline engine was, maybe 15, 20, 25% efficient, whereas a steam engine was like 5, 10% efficient. So your effort into motion out just expanded incredibly. And that's when we started seeing things like Winston Churchill, who decided, was the head of the British Navy, decided to take the radical step of going from a coal-fired Navy to an oil-fired Navy. Because you could transfer oil more easily, it was more energy dense, the ships could go faster, they could go farther without refueling. There's a tiny little problem that most of the oil was in the Middle East. And a fact that very few people know is that the first place that the British sent troops in the First World War, Belgium? No. Baghdad. The first place. Because the Germans were planning to build a rail line from Baghdad to Europe to transport crude oil. And the British, with its new oil-fired navy, did not want the Germans to gain control of the Middle East. So the Middle East was a huge, huge contentious part of World War I, and a big concern for the British. And as a result of having an oil-fired navy instead of a coal-fired navy, the British pretty much wiped up the ocean with the Germans during the First World War. It was the British blockade of the Germans that really won the First World War. So we've gotten through to oil, and at the point that we have oil and we can make a device that turns fuel into motion small, that's when it all goes to hell, or to heaven, depending on how you want to look at it. Because if you think about the steam era, the coal era, the steam era, well, go back on the horse era, you could go about 5 or 10 miles an hour for 6 hours. And that's as far as you could really go. You could transport stuff by canal boat, right? Where you could pull like 100,000 pounds, 150,000 pounds with 2 mules, but 2.5 miles an hour, right? So we were really limited in scope and speed. And then steam, you had an engine that was the width of this room, right? That would take up this entire space. It required a team of people to maintain, and a big pile of coal in another car to operate. But you could drag a whole bunch of cars behind it on a set of rails, and you could go, 25, 30 miles an hour. By the end of the coal era, and the end of the coal era was not until 1950, when we were burning more oil than coal. As the coal consumption went down and oil consumption, that wasn't until 1950, and we still had coal-fired railroads, like way late. In fact, the Chinese were making coal-fired engines till 1983 because they had coal. But it takes a big structure to do that. You have to have one big engine. Then, with the advent of gasoline and diesel, you could shrink it down, and you could have an engine this big instead of as big as the front of this room. And that's when you could start putting them on carriages. And people could travel around individually on carriages with a little engine burning this 100-to-1 EROI fuel that was convenient, where you could carry an incredible amount of energy in a bucket and put it into something the size of this podium and go 25, 30 miles an hour for as long as you didn't run out of the stuff in the bucket. And that was this massive change in how human beings got from point A to point B. And we've just gone from there, and it's a matter of degree rather than paradigm, right? We can go faster and farther and higher and all that, but the real change came when we went from, one, how long can you keep a horse going before it falls down? Two, we have this machine that we can just pour endless amounts of seemingly endless fossil fuels into, and it can go from one end of the country to the other. To, here's a device that maybe two people can pick up, right? And that will take us individually wherever we want, as long as we just keep putting this stuff into it. So that's how we got here. We've got a little time here. If you want to ask questions about any particular thing in this whole, I'm happy to answer. But otherwise, I've reached the end of what I'm talking about. Yeah.
What kind of EROI do we get out of fracking and other modern oil?
Well, I'll be talking more about this in a couple of days, but I'll give you a preview. EROI has dropped from 100 to 1 in the 1920s or so. It's below 15 to 1 now. And in the case of tar sands, it's below 5.
Whoa.
And ethanol is below 2.
Wow, we're back to
About nuclear.
Nuclear, it depends on who you talk to. There's a lot of arguing about that. But it's hard to calculate. It's hard to calculate with nuclear. But some people say around 12 to 1. Some people say 4 to 1. What's hard to calculate is that, like, for instance, right now on the shores of the Connecticut River, there are some big concrete canisters of nuclear waste. And they're going to be hot for 25,000 years. So what's the energy cost of maintaining those canisters? Even though it's very minimal year to year, 25,000 years, that's a long time. And we got 40 years of energy out of that power plant. Now, our kids are going to have to deal with it for 25,000 years. And when you consider that 10,000 years ago, my hometown of Middlebury, Vermont, was under salt water because the Lake Champlain was an inlet of the Atlantic Ocean. So, what's the upper Connecticut River going to look like 25,000 years from now? I have no prediction. But that's a different question. But the question is, well, how do you account for the EROI of something that's going to stick around and need operations and maintenance for 25,000 generations?
And 4 to 1 was horsepower, right?
Well, 4 to 1 means how much energy do you put into mining uranium, refining uranium into fuel,
Right.
transporting it, building the nuclear power plant, operating and maintaining
I
it.
understand, but you were talking about the tar sands and the...
Oh, tar sands, that's
and
how
the
much...
fracked, but you were giving the EROI...
EROI, yeah.
Yeah, and with horsepower, it was 4 to 1.
It was 4 to 1 for horsepower.
So now we're
lowering
back.
the horsepower.
with a whole lot more complicated effort. We're
back to
back at
4 to 1.
horsepower.
Yeah, back to horsepower, back to 4 to 1, yeah.
Food for thought there, huh?
Yeah, right.
What's the EROI for solar and wind currently?
Solar and wind are in the teens right now and going up, actually. A few years ago, there was a refined silicon shortage. Solar power was taking off. Everybody was putting in solar, and there weren't enough refineries making the purified silicon for the cells. And so the price was going up, and all the manufacturers were like, oh my God, how can we make thinner cells with less, silicon or less purified silicon or anything help? And so they did that. And so now the cells that you see in solar panels like those, you can't pick them up with your fingers. They would shatter. They can only be picked up by special little suction things and put into the lamination. So yeah, they're in the teens. You and then you? Yeah.
I'm curious thing about this EROI comparison between flexible tar sands and horses. Is there a factor that involves in the distribution system that makes it still valuable not to go back to horses? How do you calculate that into EROI?
EROI is a question of where you draw the dotted line, because Generally, EROI is drawn around to the wellhead, like coming. How much does it cost to get it out of the ground and in a barrel? You know. And with the horse, there's no out of the ground. There's just like the hay, and the horse lives near the hay and all that. So it's just how much of your land is taken up. You know, if you're a farmer and you have 100 acres, how much of your land is taken up just feeding your method of pulling things around, which is the horse. And that's about 4 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1. And with the tar sands, it's how much does it take to, you know, build the equipment, explore, drill, you know, pump, do all the things, expend all that to get the oil as oil out of the ground and into a barrel. That's where you draw the line. You had a question over? You did. You had a question.
I would assume that they don't know enough about tidal energy yet to calculate that, but do they have hopes for a big number?
Tidal energy.
Repeat that question, please.
What? Oh, she was asking about tidal energy and what's up with that. Tidal energy is tricky because it's very geographically specific. You have to have high tides and fast tides and things like that. And you're trying to put a piece of complex machinery under salt water. And that's tricky to keep a piece of electrical equipment going under salt water. People have managed it. In the East River, right next to Manhattan, there were some company called Verdant Energy put what looked like short-bladed wind turbines on the bottom of the East River and ran them on the tide. But we've been doing it for centuries. I worked for a client that was a family-owned island up off the coast of Maine, and they had an inlet. They had a bay, sort of semicircular bay, and they 200 years ago or so, they built a stone wall looking much like the breakwaters here across the front of the bay with a slot in it, and they put a mill in the slot. So they would let the tide build up against the outside of it and then run the tide in and fill up the bay and get power, grind grain, whatever. And then they'd let the tide go out outside of it and then let the water run out. So tidal energy is not new, it's just more sophisticated. There was a question way in the back.
And I'm understanding that there's a difficulty in translation between early EROI of the horse, which is about land, and subsequent EROI, which is about money.
Well, actually, no, subsequent EROI is still about energy. It's still about energy investment.
But it's not about land.
It's not about land
The
anymore.
horses, I mean, when you're, I'm just thinking the basis of the calculation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, because, you know, you had a certain amount of calories you could get out of 100 acres, right? Some more concentrated than the others, like you could grow wheat or you could grow hay, but your basic energy source was sun falling on ground, right? So how much of that solar energy falling on that, your aperture, your area, how much of that did you have to dedicate to the horses as opposed to you and everything else you wanted to do? But yeah, it's a different kind of calculation.
There's a basic similarity between solar and farming, because in both cases you're talking about amount of real estate that has to be dedicated to either growing the crops for the horse or to capture the sun.
Yeah.
So both of them require real estate, whereas drilling for oil is much smaller footprint on the surface.
Yeah, that's one of the things about going back to solar. I mean, because the horse was solar energy. You know, we're solar energy. People say, well, can solar energy really work? Yeah, it works 3 times a day for me. You know, when you think about it, you open a window, right? The amount of sunlight that comes in through 1 square foot of window on a blue sky day is equivalent to a 2,000 watt theatrical light. That's the amount of energy that comes in through 1 square foot of window. Now think about trying to pay for like 2,000 watt theatrical lights to like come in through the window. I mean, kind of pricey. But anyway.
So if I understood you correctly, you said that over time now EROI has declined?
Yes.
So how do we account for the fact that gasoline is a price, when you adjust for inflation, is so relatively low right now?
Because there's above ground factors and below ground factors. And below ground factors are things like what's the geology, what's the permeability, what's the, all that kind of stuff. And then above ground factors are politics and economics and things like that, where, for instance, you get a bunch of countries that are all producing, let's say, slightly higher EROI. EROI is not the same all over the world, right? Fracked oil has a very low EROI. If you're talking about the Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia, the biggest oil field in the world that was discovered in 1948, the EROI is, 20 to 1, 30 to 1, something like that, right? It's very high EROI. And they're selling a lot of them as a glut, And we're, right now, the fracking companies in the United States, the drilling companies, 2/3 of them are losing money. 2/3 of them. I think in the last year, 89 of them went bankrupt.
Good.
They're all like little tiny companies, compared to ExxonMobil, really. And they're all drilling away, fracking away, and they're all selling oil and natural gas below their cost of production. And not all of them, but like 2/3, 3/4 of them are selling below their cost of production. And the only reason they're staying in business is because further invent the next biggest fool, investing more. And the strategy, if you can call it that, is that each company is thinking, if I can outlast all these other guys, and they all go bankrupt, the supply will go down and the price will go up. And I'll be able to buy their leases, their land leases, for pennies on the dollar, and I'll be left. I'll be the survivor on the island. And then the price will go up to $75 a barrel, and I will make loads of money. Right? So that's everybody's theory, but not everybody's going to win. Right? So that's why we have cheap oil right now, is a bunch of companies with a bunch of investors all plowing money into fracking that 99% of them will never see back. Yeah, and that's the history of American infrastructure, actually. If you look back at it, railroads, canals, bridges, roads, there were always a set of initial investors like, yes, we're going to build the canal, or we're going to build the railroad, and they built it, and it was too expensive, and they lost everything, and then somebody else came in and bought it for pennies on the dollar and operated it, right? Fiber optic cables, 1990s, right? People came in, we're going to cover America with fiber optic cables, and the internet wasn't ready. And there was what's called dark fiber all over the place. All sorts of fiber companies went bankrupt. And then people came in, bought it for pennies on the dollar, and now we have cheap fiber optic. But thank you, stupid investors who came in first and lost all your money. But all the railroads across America, the canals, everything. And now the frackers are giving us, thank you, stupid investors, for giving us cheap oil. But the problem is that we're reacting to that supply as if this was going to go on forever. And so right now, natural gas is about 1/3 the price it needs to be for most fracking companies to break even. 1/3. And the price of electricity parallels the price of natural gas, because the marginal cost is peak generation. Those big natural gas power plants that they fire up in the afternoon on June 17th, July 17th, when everybody turns on the air conditioning, that's what drives the cost of electricity. I mean, we pay a steady rate all year, that's because it's an average, but that steady rate is governed by that most expensive electricity that we buy in the afternoon, July 17th. Because the cost of the utilities could be $1 a kilowatt hour right then. So when natural gas goes to 3 times its present hub price, yeah, electricity is going to go as well. So, yeah, so we're living in a fool's paradise, I guess is the summation, right? Other questions? Now that we're all headed to jump off the bridge. Yeah?
The calculations about energy return on investment leave aside externalities.
Right.
When your horses, you have to nourish them, and you have to use farming practices, and
Yeah.
farming practices may cause damage to when we now extract fracking oil, fracking it, transport it somewhere where it can be used, and there's very good history about having reliable pipelines
Yeah.
that don't, for example, cause local ecological disasters,
Sure.
pollution of water.
EROI is not a moral calculation. EROI is a very technical calculation of the amount of energy you put in versus the amount of energy, and it's sort of the baseline of like, is this viable or is this not viable, and how viable is it? And I'm going to get into externalities later in the week, and I'm going to spend a lot of time dealing with externalities, so you have to show up. Yeah, in the back there, and then you. Yeah. Electric cars. You're gonna have to come back too, because I'm gonna do a whole big thing on cars. But let me put it this way, that electric cars are like nature getting hit with a broomstick instead of a baseball bat. Okay. It's not, it's better, but anyways, you got a question, then you, well, you and then you, yeah.
You've been talking about energy that the sun already gave us over millions of years.
Yeah.
And the problems that that now has caused us.
Yeah.
And I suspect you're headed towards the energy that the sun gives us instantaneously every day, like
right.
wind and solar. And you wonder if we'll ever make it. There's not enough instantaneous energy that we can capture, really. Yeah. To replace all that we shouldn't be burning anyway.
Yeah.
So is it doomsday? Is that where we're headed?
No. Don't grab a cinder block and walk into the bay. Don't. Okay. The thing is that, just to give a sense of scale, you could power the United States on a 25-mile square block of solar panels.
But we have to have it.
Would you have to have them? But the scale of the energy that's dumping on our heads all the time, compared to the scale of the energy we're using, is completely out of whack. There's huge amounts of energy falling on our heads every day. And what I'm going to be talking about, for instance, tomorrow, is how to actually collect some of that energy that's falling on our heads, as opposed to ignoring it. And in fact, people knew about this. You know, people used to know about this. The way we know. You have a question?
You mentioned early July 17th when everyone turns on the air conditioning.
Yeah.
Why is it that so few utilities charge or meter the use of electricity?
Could you repeat the question?
When we get charged, because everybody turns on the air conditioner on July 17th, right? And there's these huge peaks of demand. Why do utilities just charge us an average as opposed to none? Well, for the utilities, it's simply financial. That it's easy to charge everybody an average as long as they cover their peak costs as opposed to their 4 a.m. costs, and average it all out well enough. It's like an insurance company, right? Some people crash, some people don't. Some people, as long as on average they charge enough, they make money. And for them, it's just simpler to say, like, everybody X cents per kilowatt hour all the time, no matter what. And they've tried time of use in places, and what happens is that electricity is so damn cheap that most people don't care. You can put them on time of use and you're like, I'll spend an extra 5 cents and run the washing machine. Who cares, right? There's like 10% of the population that actually cares about the environment and this and that and the other, and they're like, yeah, we're not gonna run the machine here, we're gonna wait till then, and everybody else is like, whatever, 7.5 cents, I don't care. So that's why, they tried it in the 1970s, 1980s, and people were just like, shrug. So, Roddy, you?
Yeah, ethanol, what's the EROI for?
It can go negative. Yeah, it can go negative. Corn is incredibly energy intense. Corn ethanol. Actually, some people just recently figured out that the growing of corn produces enough pollution mostly from actually ammonia from the fertilizer coming off the fields, that it kills about 4,300 people a year. And that the health costs of growing corn are something on the order of $39 billion a year. And we produce about $58 billion a year of corn in the United States. So add 2/3 to the cost of corn for the health cost of just growing corn.
Wow.
Much less the health cost of eating, all the crap that's made from it. But
Where are the health costs of growing corn?
I'm sorry, Henry.
Is it all from the ammonia that's used as fertilizer?
Yeah, it's ammonia fertilizer. I mean, sure, there's the emissions from the diesel engines, and there's all that other stuff, and the people dying from inhaling the pesticides and stuff, on the farm. But there's also just the ammonia coming off and goes down with, turns into other stuff, reacts in the air and all that. So yeah, they figure the death toll from growing corn is about 4,300 people a year, plus a lot of people getting sick. Anyways, yeah. Sugarcane ethanol actually has a better EROI, like around 7 or 8, because it's grown down in Brazil and the inputs are less and all that. But it's still not fantastic. Yeah. But in terms of making ethanol, and I've looked at numbers, and I think I'll be showing you later numbers on cellulosic ethanol and all that kind of stuff, and it's all really low. When you're actually boiling and processing stuff to try and make energy out of plant material, it's like, you're not going to do that well. Do I actually have another slide? Is that it? No, that's it. Other questions? I'm saying right? Yeah.
Where do you see the current administration is trying to push? More coal.
Do share.
Where's it going?
Where's it going? Well, coal EROI is going down, as you might imagine.
Yes.
And the thing is that fracked gas is killing coal. Because, thank those stupid investors, because they're making your air slightly better, because they're subsidizing the cost of natural gas, and so natural gas is cheap, so everybody's like, yeah, we're going to run the natural gas power plants. To hell with coal. And so coal production is actually going down, and coal use is actually going
Not
down.
much like coal's coming back.
No, it's not coming back. It is not. No. And there are now more people employed in the renewable energy industry in Vermont than there are coal miners in the United States.
We were talking. Repeat that.
I'm going to repeat that. Okay.
Thanks.
There are more renewable energy employees, workers in Vermont than there are coal miners in the United States. Actual coal miners in the mines.
How many coal miners are left?
About 15,000.
Really?
Yeah. Well, now they have a machine the size of this building that grinds coal out of the strip mines. And so that's like 1,000 guys, in one machine. And it's just...
So that coal coming back is really fake news.
Yeah, it's like, no, it's not coming back. No, it's just not economic. Actually, the UK, which is a huge producer of coal, user of coal for power, it has now gone like 185 days, 200 days, something like that, without burning coal in any power plant. because they have so much wind and solar and hydro, a lot of wind actually. But they have like virtually eliminated coal from their grid. It's amazing. Yeah.
So when all that fracked gas comes back up to its at least market price of $70-80 a barrel equivalent,
Yeah.
Isn't coal going to come back?
By that time, what you're going to see is that the price of solar and wind has gone down so much that right now, super large solar fields are bidding out at like 5 cents a kilowatt hour or something like that. You know, which is like right around coal. Coal is like 4 or 5 cents a kilowatt hour, something like that, and it's going to be going up. And wind is bidding out at 4 cents, 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So the cost of raw electricity from renewables is going to, you know. Yeah. Question in the back. Yeah. You.
Just curious if all that great new cheaper solar are there a bunch of bankrupt investors?
No. They just tightened their belts. It was kind of, there was a few companies that went bankrupt, but basically they made everything thinner and lighter and faster and you know, better. I mean, you know, I told you like one machine now replaces 1,000, you know, coal miners. In the photovoltaic industry, making industry, you can buy it's called a tool, and what they say a tool is actually an entire factory. It's like they refer to it that way because basically you put in processed silicon and aluminum and glass, sheet glass at one end, and modules come out the other. And there's like 3 people running the whole factory. You know, like it's just this big robot that produces solar, and that's not the way it used to be. And so the cost of when I was in the solar industry doing commercial stuff back in 2003 or so, I was designing systems that were like 100,000 watts, 200,000 watts, which was like a big system back then. And if I could beat a vendor down to $3.30 a watt for solar, like just solar panels in a shipping container, $3.30 a watt, I was the dude with a big back, you know, I was the man. Now, you can buy solar panels by the pallet for 35 cents a watt, like 1/10 that. And not even by the shipping container, by the pallet. And, you know, it's completely flipped over the cost thing where you know, it's the best investment you can make. I mean, if you live in a state that does net metering, putting solar energy, putting PV on your roof, like you should take whatever you need out of your investment account. Because if you went to your investment advisor and you said, hey, look, I want an investment. I want an investment that returns between 6 and 12% ROI, that's insured, okay, and inflation adjusted, and you know, tax-free. Your investment advisor would spit their coffee, and if they weren't drinking coffee, they'd go get some, so they'd have something. You know, they wouldn't sprain anything spitting; they would get something to come out of their mouth. But that's solar, because it'll get you between 6 and 12%. It's offsetting the electricity that you're using, so it's tax-free, right? It's not income. It's just your electric bill just dropped by $1,000 or whatever. It's insured because it's on your house, so it's part of your homeowner's insurance, and it's roughly inflation adjusted because the price of electricity goes up, roughly speaking. So it's like the investment that no investment advisor can offer you. So.
Are we manufacturing those solar panels here, or are they coming from China?
Mostly China, a little bit here. Yeah, mostly China. Yeah.
You probably get into this, but does your EROI on solar include storage?
No, that's generally just big, direct to utility kind of deals. You're right. Yeah.
What about thermal solar? Is that still
Still viable, and large-scale thermal solar for, turning heat into electricity, that's being developed more as well. It has a fairly good EROI on it these days, getting better. But yeah, solar hot water. The EROI on solar hot water is not as good as PV right now. A lot of copper, a lot of plumbing, but it's a lot better than burning whatever. Other question? Yeah?
How much does government subsidy, how much of a role does government subsidy play in like influencing choice of like energy? So you have fossil fuels is massively subsidized. There's some subsidy involved in photovoltaic and wind. Like what does the landscape look like in terms of government subsidy now?
It's everything. Yeah, it's everything. I'm going to get into that a couple days from now. I'm going to get deep into subsidy and regulation. But yeah, it's everything. So we're kind of getting along here. Yeah, I'd say that's that today. I'll see you